The rain had been falling since 4 in the afternoon, the kind of steady, indifferent October rain that turned the streets of Cookeville, Tennessee into long dark mirrors and kept most people inside their houses with their televisions on and their curtains drawn. By 7 in the evening, the Blue Ridge Diner on Willow Creek Road was emptier than usual, which suited Sarah Mitchell just fine because her right knee had been aching since her morning shift and she had already been on her feet for 9 hours, and the idea of running between full tables for another 2 was not something her body was willing to discuss without complaint. Sarah was 34 years old, though she had been told she could pass for younger, which she accepted as the compliment. It was intended to be while privately, knowing that the reason for it was that she had never had the luxury of wearing the kind of tired that shows on a face. She kept herself moving, kept herself neat, kept her dark blonde hair pulled back in a low braid that she redid on her break, and kept the kind of expression on her face that said she was glad you were here even on the evenings when gladness was the last thing she actually felt. Her eyes were the color of creek water in summer, a greenish gray that changed with the light, and they were the feature that strangers most often mentioned, which she always found slightly absurd given that eyes were not something a person could take any credit for. She had been working at the Blue Ridge for 7 years. She had arrived at the job when her son, Noah, was 3 weeks old and she was 27, and the man who had been her boyfriend for 2 years had been gone for 6 weeks, and the nursing program she had been enrolled in at Tennessee Tech had sent her a letter about deferring her enrollment, which she had read 3 times and then put in a drawer and never responded to. She had not gone back to school. She had not found another man. She had found this diner, and Marcus Lee, the owner, who was 63 and had the disposition of a man who had seen enough of life's cruelty to be softened by other people's rather than hardened, and he had hired her without hesitation and had been decent to her every single day since 7 years. Noah was now 7, thin and serious and obsessed with maps of all things. Paper maps, the kind you had to fold and unfold, which he collected from rest stops and gas stations, and which he kept in a wooden box under his bed organized by state. He had dark hair and olive skin, features that came from his father's side, and he had his father's way of going very still when he was thinking hard about something, a stillness that used to stop Sarah cold in the first few years, but that she had made her peace with because the alternative, resenting her own child for looking like someone who had left, was not something she was willing to carry. Noah's father was a man named Marcus Webb. She did not call him Marcus in her head because it would have confused the names. She called him by his last name, Webb, even in her own thoughts, which was the kind of small mental distance a person builds to survive proximity to an old wound. Webb had been 26 when she got pregnant, finishing a graduate program in Portland, Oregon, and when she told him, he had gone very quiet in a way that was different from Noah's stillness. Not thoughtful, but retreating, and 3 weeks later he had said he was not ready, and he was going back to Oregon, and he was sorry, and he had meant it when he said he loved her. He genuinely had, but he was not able to do this. He had said it the way people say things they have rehearsed until the words came out smooth and clean. Then he left. She had not heard from him since. Not on Noah's birthday. Not on the holidays. Not when Noah lost his first tooth or started school or spent an entire summer obsessed with rivers and drew maps of every waterway within 100 miles of Cookeville with a level of geographic accuracy that made his second-grade teacher call Sarah to say she thought he might be gifted nothing. 7 years of nothing. Sarah had decided early on that she would not make Noah carry the weight of a father's absence by talking about it constantly, but she would not pretend the absence wasn't real either. When Noah asked, she answered honestly. His father had not been ready. His father had left. She did not know where he was. That was the truth, stripped of malice and stripped of decoration, and she told it plainly, because she believed children deserved plainness even when plainness hurt. The Tuesday evening in October when the man walked in, Sarah had 2 tables occupied, a retired couple sharing a piece of coconut cream pie and nursing their decaf with the particular leisure of people who had nowhere to be, and appreciated that fact. And a teenage girl sitting alone with her phone and a grilled cheese, waiting out the rain. The man came through the door at 7:22. She knew the time because she had just glanced at the clock above the E counter while refilling the coffee pot. He was old, not ancient but genuinely old in the way that carries its full weight, somewhere in his mid to late 60s, with white hair that had been neatly combed at some point earlier in the day but had conceded to the rain, and a face that was broad and lined, in the way of someone who had spent a great deal of his life making serious decisions. He wore a dark green rain jacket over a collared gray shirt, and he was the kind of man whose clothes, while plain, gave the impression of someone who had chosen them deliberately. He carried no bag. He carried nothing at all. He came through the door, shook the rain from his jacket, and looked around the diner with the calm, methodical look of someone assessing a room without being anxious about what he found. He chose a table near the window, not the corner booth, which was where most lone customers sat. The table near the window, where the rain streaked down the glass and the parking lot lights made the wet pavement glow orange. Sarah walked over. Evening. Pretty miserable out there. He looked up at her and something moved across his face that she couldn't name, not recognition exactly, but a kind of attention, like he was looking at something he had been preparing himself to look at. Then it settled and he nodded. "It is coffee if you have it. Always." She pulled out her notepad. "Anything to eat?" "Kitchen still full open." He looked at the menu, though she had the sense he wasn't really reading it. "Whatever your hot special is. Meatloaf with mashed potatoes and green beans. It's good tonight." "That'll be fine." He said it quietly without emphasis, the way people speak when their mind is elsewhere. She brought him his coffee and he thanked her and she left him to it. Over the next 40 minutes she watched him. Not intrusively, but in the ambient way that servers observe their tables, filling in the portrait with small details. He drank his coffee slowly. He ate when the food came with the methodical attention of someone who was fueling himself rather than enjoying a meal. He did not look at his phone. He did not have a phone that she could see. He looked out the window at the rain, and occasionally he looked at his coffee cup, and once he closed his eyes for a long moment in a way that was not sleepy, but something more deliberate, as though he was practicing something interior. The retired couple finished their pie and paid and left with cheerful good nights to Sarah, that she returned warmly. The teenage girl finished her grilled cheese, tipped $3 on a $9 check, which Sarah always privately appreciated from young people because it meant someone had taught them well, and left at 8:15. By 8:20, the man near the window was her only table. She refilled his coffee without being asked, and he looked up at her, and this time the expression on his face had shifted into something she could only describe as resolved, like a man who had been working himself toward saying something, and had finally arrived. "You're Sarah Mitchell," he said. She stopped. The coffee pot was still in her hand. Something in her chest did a complicated thing that she would later struggle to describe. "I am," she said carefully. "My name is Daniel Hurst." He paused. He seemed to be measuring what came next. "I drove here from Portland, Oregon. It took me 4 days." Another pause. "I was a judge for 27 years in Multnomah County. I retired 2 years ago." He looked at his coffee cup. "My son's name was Marcus Webb. He passed away 7 months ago. A cardiac event. He was 38 years old." The diner was very quiet. The rain on the windows was the loudest thing in the room. Sarah stood with the coffee pot and she did not say anything for several seconds because the thing inside her chest had gone from complicated to something she could not organize quickly, enough to speak around. "I'm sorry," she said finally, because it was true regardless of everything else. Daniel Hurst nodded. "Before he died," he said slowly, "he talked to me. He talked about a lot of things. Men do that, apparently, when they know the time is short. The doctors had told us in January. He had until June, they said, and they were right almost to the week. He turned his coffee cup once on the table. He talked about you. He talked about your son. His son, he said the last 2 words with a weight that suggested he had been carrying them for months. He had never told me. In 7 years, he had never told me I had a grandson and I did not know it. Sarah set the coffee pot down on the nearest table because she did not trust her grip on it anymore. He asked me to find you, Daniel continued. He could not come himself. He was not well enough to make the trip, and truthfully, I think he was also not brave enough. And I am not saying that to be cruel. I am saying it because he said it himself. He said he had spent 7 years being a coward, and he did not want to be one on the way out if he could help it. The old man's voice was steady, but the steadiness had a quality to it, the quality of something that has been practiced and maintained by effort. He wrote a letter. For Noah, he asked me to deliver it. Sarah pressed her lips together. She breathed through her nose slowly. Mr. Hurst, she said, and her voice was even. She was proud of how even it was. I appreciate that you drove 4 days to be here. I do, but I need a moment. Of course. She went to the kitchen. She stood at the stainless steel counter, and she pressed both palms flat against the cool surface, and she looked at the wall, and she breathed. Marcus Webb had died 7 months ago, and she had not known. She had not known because there was no system by which she would know. No connection, no thread between his life and hers except a 7-year-old boy who collected paper maps and went still when he was thinking. Marcus Webb had died at 38, knowing he had a son he had never met. He had died, and his last act of fatherhood was to send his own father across 4 states in the rain. She stayed in the kitchen for 4 minutes. Then she went back out. Daniel Hurst had finished his coffee. He had placed the check folder at the edge of the table, and on top of it he had placed exact cash. She could see the bills and the coins. Payment to the sent with nothing extra. As she approached, he stood, with the careful movement of a man whose joints required consultation, and he put on his rain jacket. I have left something under my plate, he said. I want you to know before you find it, so that you have a moment to prepare yourself. There is a letter for Noah, and there is something else, something Marcus saved. He should have sent it years ago, and he didn't. And he knew that, and it doesn't fix anything. But it's yours. It belongs to your son. He looked at her directly. I am staying at the Holiday Inn on Highway 70. If you want to speak further, or if you have questions, I will be there for 2 days before I drive back. If you don't want to see me again, I understand that completely, and I hold no grievance. He picked up his jacket collar against the thought of the rain. He was not a bad man, my son. He was a frightened boy who became a man who still hadn't learned not to run. I am not asking you to forgive him. That is not mine to ask. But he did love you. He told me that clearly, and I believed him. He paused. He also said your eyes were the color of a creek in summer. He said he never forgot that. Then he walked to the door, opened it against the rain, and was gone. Sarah stood in the empty diner for a moment that had no real length. Then she walked to the table by the window where the rain still streaked the glass, and the orange parking lot light still made the wet pavement glow. She picked up the plate. Beneath it was a sealed white envelope. On the front, in handwriting she had never seen but recognized nonetheless, as belonging to the same person who had given Noah that stillness, that particular way of going quiet, and it said simply, For Noah, from your dad. Beneath the envelope was a cashier's check. She picked it up and looked at it. $43,200, drawn on a Portland credit union, made out to Sarah Ann Mitchell. She sat down in the chair where Daniel Hurst had been sitting. She sat down because her legs made the decision before she did. She set the check on the table, and she held the envelope with both hands, and she did not open it, because it was not hers to open. It was Noah's. Everything about this moment was ultimately Noah's, and that understanding arrived in her with the particular clarity of something that bypasses thought entirely and goes directly to the place where you know things. She cried, not loudly. The diner was empty and the rain was coming down, and Marcus Lee had gone home at 6 and the cook had left at 8:30, and she was alone in the Blue Ridge Diner on Willow Creek Road, and she cried the way a person cries when they have been carrying something so long that they have stopped noticing the weight until someone points at it and says, look, you've been carrying that, and the recognition of it is what breaks you open. She cried for the 27-year-old girl who had told a man she was pregnant and watched his face go somewhere she couldn't follow. She cried for the 3 weeks she had spent waiting for him to come back and say he had been wrong. She cried for every birthday where she had answered Noah's questions plainly and carefully and walked away from the conversation and stood in the kitchen doorway and breathed through it. She cried for a 38-year-old man she had not loved in 7 years who had died in Portland in June with a letter he had written to his son still unsent on his bedside table, or wherever it had been, because she imagined it somewhere concrete, somewhere she could see it. She cried because grief does not ask whether the person who caused it deserves your tears. It simply comes when it comes. She sat in that chair for 20 minutes. Then she cleaned up his table, washed the dishes, wiped down the counters, locked the front door of the Blue Ridge Diner, and drove home in the rain. Noah was asleep. He always asleep by 8:30 because he was 7 and because he went to sleep, the way he did everything, completely and without resistance, as though sleep was simply the next thing to be fully committed to. She stood in his doorway for a long time. His wooden map box was visible under the edge of his bed. One of his Tennessee state maps was on his nightstand, folded incorrectly, the way he always refolded them because the original folds confused him. She sat at her kitchen table, with the envelope and the cashier's check and a cup of tea she made but did not drink. And she thought about the 2 days Daniel Hurst had said he would be at the Holiday Inn on Highway 70. She thought about what she would do with $43,000. She thought about the Tennessee Tech nursing program that had sent her a deferral letter 7 years ago that she had put in a drawer and never answered. She thought about whether the drawer still existed, which it did in the spare room, in the small blue filing cabinet that she had moved 3 times without ever going through. She thought about what she would say to Noah, how she would begin, where she would sit and what words she would use and whether 7 was old enough, which she believed it was because she had promised herself plainness, and plainness did not have an age requirement. She thought about a man she had called Webb in her own head for 7 years, opening his eyes in a hospital bed in Portland and asking his father to drive 4 days in a rental car to deliver a letter to a boy he had never met. She thought about whether that counted for something. She decided it did. Not enough to rewrite the 7 years, not enough to settle the grief or quiet the anger she still felt some mornings when Noah looked at her with that particular stillness, and she had to breathe through what it reminded her of. But something, a thing that was real. She called the Holiday Inn at 9:15 the next morning. Daniel Hurst answered the room. Phone on the second ring with the attentiveness of a man who had been waiting for it. "Mr. Hurst," she said, "this is Sarah Mitchell." "Yes," he said, and then quietly, "Thank you for calling." They met at the diner at 10. It was a clear morning after the rain, and the light was the clean, bright light that only comes after a heavy night storm. She brought Noah. She had told him that morning over breakfast, plainly and carefully, that his father had passed away, and that his father's father, his grandfather, a word that sat strangely in both their mouths, had driven all the way from Oregon to bring him a letter. Noah had gone very still in the way he went still. He had looked at his cereal bowl. Then he had looked up and said, "Did my dad know about my maps?" Which broke Sarah's heart in such a specific and unexpected direction that she had to turn toward the stove for a moment before she could answer. She had told him she didn't know, but that he could ask his grandfather. Daniel Hurst was already in the diner when they arrived. He was sitting at the same table by the window. He was wearing the same gray-collared shirt under a different jacket, a blue one today, and he had coffee in front of him that he had not yet touched. When he saw Noah walk through the door beside Sarah, something happened to Daniel. Hurst's face that Sarah had never seen happen to a face before. It was not quite the same as recognizing someone. It was more like the confirmation of something that had been an abstraction until that moment, a fact becoming real, a grandson becoming a child, who was standing 3 feet away with his mother's greenish-gray eyes and his father's dark hair and a folded road map of Tennessee sticking out of his jacket pocket. Daniel Hurst said, "Hello, Noah." And Noah, who had been very still since breakfast, looked at the old man carefully and said, "Are you really my grandfather?" "I am," Daniel said. I'm sorry it took me so long to find you. Noah considered this with the seriousness he brought to maps and rivers and things that required study. Then he pulled out the Tennessee state map and unfolded it, not entirely correctly, and said, I have one of Oregon too, at home. Do you know where Portland is on it? And Daniel Hurst, retired judge, 27 years on the bench, a man who had presided over cases that had changed people's lives with a steadiness that other men in the courtroom had marveled at, put his hand over his mouth for just a moment. Then he said, I do. I can show you. Sarah sat across from them. She put the white envelope on the table between them. He can read it whenever he's ready, she said. I'm going to let him decide that. Daniel nodded. He looked at her with the light blue eyes that were nothing like his son's eyes, which had been dark, and he said, You have done a remarkable thing with him. I want you to know I see that. She accepted it with a small nod, because she was not sure yet what she trusted enough to say out loud in this man's presence. They were not family. They were not friends. They were two people, connected by a child and a man who was gone, and they were both still deciding what that connection was going to mean going forward. She used the $43,000 to re-enroll at Tennessee Tech in January. It covered 2 years of tuition and books, and the increased cost of child care during her class hours. Marcus. Lee agreed to keep her on for the evening shifts she could manage around her schedule, because Marcus Lee was the kind of man who would. She graduated 3 years later as a registered nurse. Noah was 10 by then, still collecting maps, now expanding into topographic ones, which his grandfather, Daniel, had encouraged by mailing him a new one from Oregon every few weeks. A correspondence that had started with the Tennessee map conversation and grown into something neither Sarah nor Daniel had quite planned, but that Noah had accepted as simply the way things were, the way children accept the structures adults build around them when those structures are stable. On the day of Sarah's graduation, Noah sat in the audience, in his good shirt with a road map of Tennessee folded in his inside pocket because he said it was for luck. And when she crossed the stage, he stood up and clapped louder than anyone around him, and he didn't seem to notice or care that he was the only one standing. She had opened his father's letter with him the previous Christmas Eve. When Noah was 9, they sat on the couch under the same lamp, and she let him read it at his own pace, which was slow because he read everything slowly and completely. She watched his face while he read. She watched the stillness move through him. When he finished, he folded the letter along its crease and held it in his lap, and after a while he said, He says he was sorry. Yes, Sarah said. Do you believe him? She thought about it honestly. She thought about a man driving 4 days through rain. She thought about $43,000, saved across 7 years, and sent without ever being able to see it arrive. She thought about an envelope, addressed in careful handwriting, to a boy whose name he had known but whose face he had never seen. I think he was, she said. I think sorry doesn't always get to someone in time. But I think he meant it. Noah looked at the letter for another moment. Then he looked up at her with his father's stillness and her father's eyes and said, Can we put it in the map box? To keep it safe? That sounds exactly right, she said. She went to get the box from under his bed, and when she came back, he had already made room for it, and they placed the letter inside, carefully enclosed the lid, and the rain that had started sometime during the evening fell soft and steady outside, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and that silence was one of the most complete things Sarah Mitchell had ever sat inside of in her life. Not healed, not finished, not all the way through the thing that had started on a rainy Tuesday evening when an old man in a green jacket placed exact change on a table and left her nothing but what was underneath a plate. But moving, steadily, plainly, without decoration, moving forward, which in the end was the only direction that had ever been available to her, and she had never once stopped taking it.